Welcome, all you adventurous readers, to the epic worlds of Alfred Döblin, where we explore the life and works of this fascinating but little-known early 20th century writer, brought to you by the website beyondalexanderplatz.com.
Welcome everyone to episode 9, where we're going to look at Berlin Alexanderplatz. I'm Chris Godwin, and I'm here with
Katie Kavanagh. Hello, everyone. So today, exciting, Berlin Alexanderplatz. This, as we know, was an international bestseller, and we're going to not necessarily talk about why as such, but we'll give you a flavour and a brief synopsis. But firstly, what's the significance of Berlin Alexanderplatz? Where does it fit in Alfred Döblin's work overall?
many so-called experts see Berlin Alexanderplatz as the absolute pinnacle of his achievement, which rendered all his previous and subsequent works, really put them well into the shadow and hardly worth bothering with. Even quite recently, publications relating to Berlin Alexanderplatz outweighed attention to any of his other 8 epic novels by something like 10 to 1. So, there's a great preponderance of scholarly interest or interest in the bookish world for this one work among many other significant works which have been cast completely into the shadows.
That's really interesting, Chris, because you've come at it in a different way. And I hope you don't mind me explaining to the listeners, but you've come to Döblin not through Berlin Alexanderplatz. You had heard of it,
Alexanderplatz.
but you had never read Berlin Alexanderplatz. The first one that you came across, was that The Three Leaps of Wang Lun?
Yes.
Yes. And from there, you opened up to other possibilities, and you kind of veered away from the more popular Berlin Alexanderplatz. However, I should let people know that you have now read it. What is your...
I should say that's not entirely fair, because
Okay.
in the early 80s, I did watch the 13-hour cinema version of Berlin Alexanderplatz.
Gosh, 13 hours.
Rainer Werner Fassbinder did a very kind of dark and gloomy and interior kind of version of Alexanderplatz.
Okay.
So yes, no, I sat through the 13 hours in cinemas in Hong Kong watching that. Yeah.
Okay. And your favorite, we should say, I think we already mentioned it in the last episode, but your favorite is Manas. But you liken Berlin Alexanderplatz, you say, is Manas with a Berlin accent. Is that right?
We'll come on to that. We'll come on to that a bit later in this episode. But
okay,
yes,
brilliant.
Manas I see is the neglected child.
Okay.
We need to occasionally give this neglected child a few toffees or something to cheer it up.
Okay, well, so hopefully in this day and age, something a bit healthier than toffees, Chris.
Well,
okay, so let's go on then. So what can we expect to hear about in this episode?
Well, I think we need to talk about how he came to write it. Something about his own relationship to Berlin, and how he gathered his materials, and some of the other things that were happening in his life between, say, mid-1927, when he first began thinking of writing this novel, and autumn 1929, when it was actually published, 2 weeks before the big Wall Street crash.
Right. Okay. Well, then let's go. How did he come to write this epic?
He'd always had this very intense relationship with Berlin, particularly the poorer quarters of Berlin, and he had a tremendous admiration for the hard work and the resilience of these poor and often sick people who were keeping the city going and manning its industries and its transport systems and so on. In 1910, for example, he'd published a piece in Der Sturm, this magazine that he'd co-founded, which was producing modernist takes on the cultural scene. There's a little piece called Nineveh upon the Spree, where he talked about beasts of toil with their wheezing lungs filled with toxic factory fumes. Innumerable diseases crawl around and mingle compassionately with the poor folk. Here, time is the only god.
Ooh.
Fairly bleak, but empathetic. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
we know he had a deep affection for Berlin and for that side of Berlin.
Yeah, and then he was telling a reading group in 1932, a year or two after publication, that here I saw such an interesting and absolutely real and as yet undescribed type of people. I observed them at various times and in the most varied circumstances, in the only true fashion, namely by sharing in their lives, their activities, and their miseries.
And is this a reference to Döblin living, him and his family living in amongst the squalor, if you like?
Well, they were living in amongst this very crowded, busy,
Busy.
noisy part of Berlin.
Yeah.
And his doctor's practice, as he said elsewhere, he came into contact with quite
A
a
huge.
variety of the criminal milieu.
Oh,
So
right.
yeah, because I mean, a lot of the action of Berlin Alexanderplatz is the underworld of pimps and criminals and robber gangs and so on. So all this was drawn from the experience he'd had of sort of interacting with such people
Sure.
in his role as a doctor to the poor.
Seeing life in all its fullness.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Really interesting. And so how did he gather all his materials? He's obviously seeing people coming and going. So he's seeing
Yeah.
different characters and people of all walks of life. Um,
Yeah. So I think we could distinguish between the actual kind of epic narrative about this fellow Franz Bieberkopf,
mhm,
um, who he pulled together from his his knowledge of sort of characteristic Berlin underworld people,
mhm,
um, but it also brought to it his views on human beings and their world and individuals living within society, which is often oppressive or difficult to deal with,
yeah,
and his idea that you can't have life without death,
right.
right?
Yeah.
Because I mean, every quality
The
sort of
antithesis.
only has a quality because there are anti qualities over there that you
Yeah.
can compare it with.
Light
Right?
without the dark.
Yeah,
Mhm,
but this epic narrative is backlit by a huge mass of kind of factual details, but descriptions of these tenement buildings and the staircases and the squalid little apartments and so on,
mhm,
tram routes. We have the prison and the slaughterhouse, pile drivers thudding away in this kind of constant building site that Alexanderplatz was during the 1920s.
mhm,
The shops, factories, trademark names, street level politics. There's a huge range of flashes and images from the city, the kind of things that people would be having sort of impinging on their consciousness every day as they walk through the city.
mhm. And do we
Um,
have anything from Dublin directly about Berlin? I know you mentioned a photo book or something
yes,
like
he
that,
wrote
but
a very long, detailed introduction to a photo book that came out in 1928. And he said, and he started off by saying all these tourists who come in and pile onto the tourist bus to be shown around, they're not actually looking at Berlin. They might just as well be in Paris or Rome. They just go and look at the tourist sites. As if they really want to see it, to show the full truth, I would have to transcribe page after page of statistical yearbooks, set down births and deaths, report on company formations, liquidations, bankruptcies, on doctors' clinics, unemployment benefit, first aid stations, lunatic asylums, fever hospitals, youth welfare, infant creches, daycare centres. And he was
wow.
actually, at this time, filling page after page of his notebooks with statistics and press cuttings and advertisements and snippets of conversations he'd overheard. Um, and many of these just are included verbatim in the text of the novel.
He's an artist at work.
well, he was the medium through which the art was working. No, we know that he was kind of channeling for every one of his great epic works. He was receiving influences from outside.
Mm.
He channeled them and put them down on the page. And often afterwards, he wasn't quite sure how he'd got there, but he's so much marvelous prose in this way where he was channeling influences. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. What else was happening in his life, 1927 to 1929?
Oh, he was actually, these few years were the kind of the peak, I think, of his activity. As in a previous episode, you talked about Döblin the writer, Döblin the activist, and Döblin the family man. I think these few
Hmm.
years were really the peak of all this activity. I
Hmm.
mean, he had his 50th birthday in the middle of 1928, August 1928. And with his friend Oscar Loerke, they put together this lovely little book celebrating his. Half of it was Döblin writing some very artful autobiographical pieces.
Hmm.
And the other half was Loerke giving kind of critical view of his works so far, i.e., before Berlin Alexanderplatz.
Right.
Then in January 1928, he was elected to the Prussian Academy, a new section for literature.
Sorry,
And
Chris, I'm just going to stop you there. What was the Prussian Academy?
well, the Prussian Academy of Arts. It's all the bigwigs were appointed, to be the bigwigs of the art world.
Okay.
When people were canvassing Döblin, seeing whether he, what views he had about being appointed to this thing, he'd written some quite long letters uh, questioning what the purpose of this new section for literature was going to be,
Hmm.
and really working out ideas of how it could become most useful in kind of rejuvenating German spiritual culture and literary culture. So when he was elected in January 1928, he immediately had a very kind of active program in mind that he put to the other people um, on this section. And then at the very end of December, as part of this active program, he delivered an enormous lecture to over 1,000 people in Berlin University,
Hmm.
where he was talking about the construction of the epic work. So this is Döblin, the literary theorist,
Hmm.
speaking about his experience as Döblin, the writer, in creating this quite new stream of narrative art, which
Interesting.
hadn't previously been seen in Germany. There were lots of
Yeah.
historical novels, for example, but they were quite often called professor novels. They were just
Okay.
full of extremely closely studied factual detail about the past, but with
Right.
no great spark. He took a very different tack, which provided a much kind of realer version of the past than these professor novels.
Okay. And who was he hanging out with at this time? So
Oh, he was good
50.
friends with Bertolt Brecht and various other writers. I mean, some of them turned out not too well after 1933. They stayed on with under the new regime, but others
Hmm.
became exiles. But yeah, they spent several winter evenings with Brecht and various other people, batting ideas around about how to reshape literature and the theatre to kind of bring it closer to more people instead of just being aimed at the middle class, this small level of kind of semi-educated middle class people.
Hmm.
All the time he was doing this, he was compiling. You remember in a previous episode we spoke about the book of natural philosophy,
Oh, yes.
published almost at the
Yeah.
same time as Manas, and which
Uh-huh.
was equally a flop, just as much of a flop as Manas.
Oh, yes. And his
And he
publishers
was,
were going
they
to
were ready
remove
to
their
cut him off.
funding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but he was all this time he was writing Berlin Alexanderplatz and doing these things for the academy and having winter evenings with Brecht and his pals and so on. He was also compiling a major follow-up to that nature book, which was eventually published in 1933. It was called Unser Dasein, Our Existence. And of
Hmm.
course, it was published in 1933, just in time to be burned by the Nazis.
Oh,
And
no.
so it basically it disappeared until it was reprinted in I think it was the 1970s.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. It's also worth mentioning, I think, that immediately before starting on Berlin Alexanderplatz in the summer of 1927,
Mm-hmm.
Döblin survived a major fever that he'd caught from botched dental work,
Oh
and
no.
he wrote a very kind of hair-raising description of his week of lying in this hospital bed, sort of sweating profusely and
Yeah.
spitting out nasty things from his mouth
Ooh,
all the time
gosh.
and whatnot. But it was a lovely example of Nietzsche's aphorism that health doesn't mean never being ill. It
Mm,
means how well do you get over being ill?
right.
And
Oh goodness.
Döblin, really,
It's a
he
sense
kept
of
telling the
his own
doctor,
mortality.
yeah, don't try to bring my fever down because the fever is my body telling me, how to get rid of all these nasty things floating around in it.
Ooh,
So
right.
anyway, I think this gave him a sense of his own mortality, which perhaps sort of
Mm-hmm.
spurred him to even more vigorous activity.
Okay, interesting.
No,
Okay.
interesting. The dentist concerned sued him for defamation, but
Oh no.
luckily Dublin won that one. Yeah, well,
Um,
this was a kind of an unqualified locum because his regular dentist had gone off to Italy on holiday.
oh, eek. Okay. All right, let's turn to the book itself then. And Alexanderplatz. Does it deserve all of the attention? Does it deserve to be a bestseller? What's all
Oh
the
yes,
hype?
no, I mean it definitely is a very fine work. Right, it's got many interesting qualities, and it's been a gold mine for literary scholars now for for nearly a century now, because
Mm-hmm.
you still come, people are still doing master's theses or doctor's dissertations on aspects of Berlin Alexanderplatz that haven't yet been thoroughly mined out,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. But it's a shame that it has so thoroughly overshadowed all his other works. I mean, I suppose the first thing to note about it is the kind of the relentless vigor of the language and of the scene shifting and of the interactions of various characters and
Mm-hmm.
the different kinds of language intermingling even within the same paragraph.
Do we still get the big cinematic spreads within Alexanderplatz?
Um,
Alexanderplatz. Do we still find that
well,
from his
I'm
earlier
not
epics,
I mean, an awful lot of it is
or is it
kind of
more
interiors. It takes place in poky little apartments, or it takes place in bars.
okay?
Um, so we don't really get as we did in Wallenstein, for example, this huge sweep from land the whole landscape, then narrowing down to, I think, an example we read, I think, in a previous episode of these three musicians at a military camp and the absolute detail of how they were shaking the bells. And you remember that?
I do, I do. Yes, I do. Now, did we actually read that in the end? I'm not sure if we published that one.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a treat in store for a later
There's a
episode.
treat. I can't remember. We've done,
Yeah.
I mean,
No, I'm sure we
listeners,
did.
we've
Yeah.
done some bonus episodes that might not see the light of day.
Okay. Well. Okay. Well, we better check the status of that reading then. Yeah. So
But it's exciting.
I mean, the language was a major issue that the scholars love to focus on. I mean, they termed this a montage novel
Right.
because it's like the modern artists who put bits of newspaper headlines against half of somebody's face and a tram coming through or something, making all kind of different bits and pieces. So there's he's got Berlin dialect, you've got bits of propaganda, you've got advertisements just sort of suddenly coming up in the middle of a paragraph, legal notices, press reports, song lyrics. There's the sounds of the city. There's lots of
Mm.
noise in the city, screeching trams and thudding pile drivers. And occasionally we've got the narrator sort of coming in with a little bit of whimsy. For example, she says, 4 people getting on the trams, Mrs. So-and-so and her friend Mrs. So-and-so. And there's
Mm-hmm.
this youngster, this pimply youngster. Um, at the age of 50, he's going to win the lottery. And then he's going to, predicting the life course of
So then it's busy. There's a lot going on. Each
Lot
scene is
going on.
busy.
But then he's
Okay.
also got biblical verses. He's got references to Greek tragedies. And Berlin is not just a kind of a film set background. I mean, in this book, the city is giving us its voice.
Okay. So I know we don't want to summarize the whole book because we don't want to give spoilers, but if we have a whole range of listeners, so some people I'm sure will have already read Berlin Alexanderplatz and some people won't. So let's just think, is there like a gist of the narrative?
Yes, I mean, I could probably do a kind of a 50-word rundown of.
Okay, let's try that. I'm going to count now.
Well, okay,
See if you can
yeah.
stick to 50 words.
So as I say, the central character is this chap called Franz Bieberkopf. He's been in jail for 4 years because he accidentally killed his girlfriend, and he sort of lost his temper one day and whacked her on the chest with an egg beater, and that cracked a rib and punctured a lung, and she died of pneumonia. So he was
Goodness.
4 years in jail for manslaughter. So he's just emerged from this hell of prison and decides he wants to lead a decent life.
So that's probably about 50 words there, Chris.
I
Do you need some more?
rather more words than I intended.
Okay, go on then.
Anyway, he's brought down by the malice of other people, by his own naivety, and poor economic conditions at this time in Berlin. And basically, he goes through 3 stages where fate deals him terrible blow. So he got the first blow. He's betrayed by a so-called friend who muscled in on his promising relationship with a widow.
Okay.
So he found that this was a great disappointment to him. He really felt laid low by this faithless friend. But the second blow.
Sorry, second blow.
Yeah, the second blow. He was lured into taking part in a gang's midnight robbery, and as they're escaping, another so-called friend throws him out of the escape car, and he's run over by the car that's chasing them and loses his arm.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. But even after that, he refuses to betray the gang.
Wow,
So anyway,
loyalty.
Eventually, with the help of some other friends, true friends, he recovers from this and gets back into circulation. And people, the old friends, particularly those who know about the gang, they say, "Oh gosh, here's Franz again. I wonder what his attitude to us is going to be now." But Franz is all mellow and willing to still be decent and so on. But then we have the third blow, that another friend of rather nasty psychopathic tendencies murders Franz's beloved girlfriend, Mieze. And that's, the lead up to that, it's about 50 or 60 pages in the middle of the novel, leading up to this dreadful event and then description of this dreadful event. And it's really, quite horrifying. Very, very, the memory stays with you as you're reading through the book.
Yeah.
And then we have the Grim Reaper appears several times in the book. We've got a description of the slaughterhouse. We've got references to the Abraham Isaac sacrifice story, and Döblin says sacrifice was the underlying theme of the whole novel.
And I remember you saying something from Bieberkopf. Döblin said Bieberkopf was
Manas auf Berlinisch.
That's it. Yes.
Manas with a Berlin accent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's come back round to that because
yes. Okay.
I mentioned that at the beginning.
Döblin's own words. It says, at the beginning of Manas, the poor hero bemoans his fate and storms onto the realm of the dead to a new life. Now I saw an accidental murderer, a condemned homicide, leaving prison, and I accompanied him on his way back into the city. What models and stimuli that provided for me! I had no particular material, but this great city, Berlin, was all around me, and I knew individual Berliners, and so, as always, I started writing with no plan, no guidelines. I devised no fable. The line was fate, the actions of a man who up to now has failed. I could rely on language, the spoken Berlin vernacular. I could create out of that, and the fates I had seen and shared. My own fate, too, guaranteed me a safe journey.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so, how was Berlin Alexanderplatz received by the public when it was first published?
Well, it's interesting. The two main Berlin newspapers refused to publish any pre-book serializations,
Mm-hmm.
but a newspaper in Frankfurt published the whole text in the few months before the book publication, and immediately received outraged letters.
And so it was published as a
Why?
serial.
Why?
So,
Hmm.
Chris, it was published as a serial. So each week a new part
Well,
would
each
be.
day, yes. I mean, each
Oh,
day
each
there's
day.
a whole
Okay.
page on the front of the magazine section or something of text from
Okay.
the chapter
All
from the
right.
novel. So he had outraged readers. So, why must I wallow in this muck when I'm trying to eat my boiled egg? You know, this kind of thing. But
And how did the newspaper respond to that?
well, they defended their decision very vigorously, and they said we wanted to open your eyes to social conditions and social relations that you would prefer not to notice. We're glad that we have stirred your complacency. And this led to many more outraged letters from professors and generals and lawyers and other conservative types.
Right.
But
So people that necessarily didn't come into contact with those characters.
yes, I mean, we talked about how out of touch the German school readers were, sort of stuck
Yeah.
in the middle of the 19th century. Well, this was that mindset still living in late 20s Berlin, of these
Mm-hmm.
conservative people who just didn't want to notice the real world going on around them.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it became an immediate bestseller, which means that lots and lots of people were quite willing to wallow in this muck.
Mm.
Um, and we'll be getting on to the way that the communist literary establishment responded to it with our reading today later on.
Okay.
And of course, there were rapid translations into several other European languages.
Mm-hmm.
So in 1931, Eugene Jolas produced his English translation. But for some reason, Döblin thought there was both an American English translation and a British English translation. But in fact, it's just the same book by Eugene Jolas.
Okay.
And
Does it
this,
have a different cover, maybe?
different covers, and often for copyright reasons, in between the wars,
Yeah.
books had to be given different titles in each country.
Oh, that's
So, I
really
mean,
interesting.
in this particular case, they were both called. Oh no, yes, they were called Alexanderplatz Berlin. The two words were changed around.
Oh,
Yeah,
interesting.
but
Okay.
yeah. Anyway, and I mean, the Jolas translation still reads very well.
Mm-hmm.
It's very lively, very enthusiastic. The Berlin jargon is converted into English slang, which is still not terribly jarring. Quite often, it's you have to wince when people try to convey foreign slang into some kind of English.
Okay. And have there been any other more recent
Yes, there was
versions?
a new English translation in 2015 by quite a well-respected um, translator and, in fact, Döblin scholar Michael Hoffman. It's a very respectable effort.
Okay. And now, does it present? I imagine presents quite a challenge for translators because of the nuances of the Berlin dialect and slang, and you said it doesn't translate terribly well when you try and put it into another language. How
Yeah,
does
yeah, and this is interesting. I mean, the French translator simply left out large chunks of the novel.
okay? Well, that's one way to deal with it.
Yeah, but then yeah, I mean, yeah, it is tricky how to convey this very city-specific non-standard German, the Berlinisch.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't just convert it, say, to Cockney or Brooklyn whatever, because then the locale, the location, becomes twisted, becomes wrong.
Right.
And then you've got so many location-specific references of streets, of shop signs, of trademarks, all kinds of things. Do you need footnotes to explain what these are? Do you just leave them as they are? Do you convert them into something which is more culturally familiar to the foreign audience? Like, you talk about Nescafe rather than Mocha Fix, something for
Okay. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
But I mean, it's interesting. The Spanish translation actually translated Berlin Alexanderplatz. They came Playa de Alejandro.
Ah,
Which
brilliant.
must have been a bit disorienting for the real. Oh, am I in Spain or am I in Germany? Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, that's really.
yeah.
Oh. Mm.
And then there are lots of little ironic and satirical little twists,
Mhm.
within, just buried away within the paragraphs in there. Like, I mean, at one point, um, there's a reference to the Greek tragedy hero or this chap Orestes,
Mhm.
but Döblin refers to him in a way, that old Orestes fellow, quite sort of disrespectfully and flippantly.
Yeah.
So on. But this would be a kind of a dig at the half-educated bourgeois, person who had an absolute reverence for ancient Greece, and they would never be disrespectful to somebody like Orestes.
Okay.
So, can the translator pick up that kind of nuance?
Mhm.
There's an awful lot of rhymed text as well, little snippets of doggerel, well, quite a lot of snippets of doggerel, um, song lyrics, little quotes from poetry, just as part of the text of the paragraph.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you have to, and it's quite interesting. I think Jolas manages to convey the kind of the rhymed doggerel bits with English rhymes, whereas Hoffman is much more sparing. He's just tending, he'd rather go with the actual meaning rather than trying to wrench the meaning in to give some
Mhm.
some English rhymes.
That's really interesting. Chris, can I ask you, what language did you read Berlin Alexanderplatz in?
I read the two translations.
The two translations. Do
But
you think
I
you would
also
read it?
referred back, when I said, "Hang on, what's that in the original?"
Mhm.
I referred back to the German to just see how they had each handled a particular
Oh,
piece.
that's interesting. So you had all three copies in front of you.
Oh yeah,
That's great. That's really interesting. Okay. Well, I wonder if it's time for us to think about a reading.
right. And we've got a fairly long bit today because um, it was quite interesting how the publication of Berlin Alexanderplatz highlighted the political split between the kind of the more sort of liberal left wing writers who, for a couple of years, had been brought together with the communist literary establishment in
Uh-huh.
the group of 1925. But the communists reacted very vehemently against Berlin Alexanderplatz because it seemed to have betrayed the class struggle.
That's
So
really
yeah,
interesting.
so there was a
I
very scorn. So there was a very I'd say harsh review of Alexanderplatz in the Communist Literary Journal, and Döblin wasn't going to let that go.
Okay.
So he made a very scornful response. So
Interesting.
Katie, perhaps you could start by reading some of the text of this harsh review
Okay.
in a suitably pompous voice
Okay.
of a left-wing doctrinaire communist literary
Right.
Gauleiter, right?
Yikes.
And
Okay.
I'll read Dublin's rebuttal.
I mean,
Yeah.
this is going to be very different for me this evening because but I mean, should I say what I've been doing today before we do this? I'm going to have to change characters very easily. This is the beauty of being a teacher. Today has been World Book
Do
Day,
you
although
want to explain to the
I
listeners
can.
what you've been doing today?
Yes, so today is World Book Day internationally, and um, I, although this podcast episode won't be coming out on World Book Day, but um, interestingly, I have been in character. I've done 3 costume changes today as the very hungry caterpillar. So I am very diverse and adept at turning my hand to all sorts of different characters. So I shall
Oh, good,
endeavour to
good.
channel my pompous
Yeah,
communist response. Here we go.
right. So
Okay, so
here we go.
this is Becca.
This is Johannes Becher talking
Okay,
about the book.
all right. Very different from the hungry caterpillar. Okay. In this book, Döblin gives unconcealed expression to his hostility to the organised proletarian class struggle insofar as he deals with politicising workers. These do not speak the language of class-conscious workers, but a tavern jargon. Döblin consciously sets out cynically to mock and ridicule the archetypal worker of our time who has been shaped by the political and economic contradictions of capital into a sharply delineated figure. Against this mass type, he sets the invented, mystical, unenlightened figure of Franz Bieberkopf, the good man, and deliberately insulates him from the proletarian class struggle. A clever mask conceals a reactionary and counter-revolutionary assault on the thesis of organised class struggle. It is no accident that in a book about Alexanderplatz, Döblin says not a word about the bloody altercations with the police. Police HQ has supervised Döblin. The book strengthens our conviction that left-leaning bourgeois writers constitute a political danger to the proletariat against which we must be on our strictest guard.
Right, well, Döblin wasn't going to let that go unchallenged, so here's his rebuttal. I'm going to talk about a thing called Linkskurve, left turn. It's 30 pfennigs an issue, octavo format. A literary magazine produced by a clique of people who blow each other's trumpet and are infallible. It's the official literary organ of the German Communist Party. I got to know this thing when it turned its attention to me. When someone gave me this issue, I was so delighted I bought some back numbers. I read through them all. Some parts were fun and some were gruesome. I'll say something about this recently created apparatus, for it is an apparatus. It produces mechanically normed criticism. Judgments are delivered on a conveyor belt. Any child can operate it. It's an automaton with controls to protect against independent thought, especially adapted to the needs of the blind and the juvenile. The first issue of Year 2 has a leader by Johannes R. Becher. Now, Becker had long been a kind of colleague of Döblin's. It's essential reading. One often wonders how it is that the party flails about so and fluffs its opportunities. And here you see why. Quote, the central task of the League of Proletarian Revolutionary Writers is the development of an indigenous proletarian revolutionary literature. So they'll sit in their headquarters and develop an indigenous literature. Herr Becher, who produces prose and smoky hymns in unswervingly expressionistic language, and his 4 not very distinguished colleagues. We are told that our proletarian revolutionary writing has made enormous progress in the past 2 years. Whatever's wrong with me? I never noticed. It must have happened out of sight in their own headquarters. Drat, why didn't they phone? It's amazing that a secret literature can blossom in our midst. But then, having just read that our proletarian writing has made enormous progress, I now learn that we are a first stammering word, a beginning, and must strive ever higher. Something's not right. How stammering fits with enormous progress is not too obvious. Maybe it has to do with Marxist dialectic. But that's such a hard topic, whole university courses chew on it. So curious as to the secret literature of enormous progress, I find Our works are not noble or polished to crystal clarity. They have a hard edge, for they are born and grow in the breeze that wafts from history. Oh, now I've missed the turning. Where, for the umpteenth time, are these works with a hard edge? Where is the breeze that wafts from history? Not in German books. They're all horribly noble and polished to crystal clarity. They're shiny as a lieutenant's riding boots. But in the Linkskurve you can find new proletarian poetry. Here's a taste, a little poem. Red dog, red rabble, oh you, radiant, wonderful, glowing believer. Today and tomorrow and the next day, and always you are there. Enough? No word needed. This is the hard edge, grown up in the breeze that wafts from history. German communist literature. Finally, Johannes R. Becher can't hold back. He has to say how it is with this new proletarian literature. He has a book of mine in front of him. The former transport worker Franz Bieberkopf, Becher sneakily omits the former, is an artificially extruded laboratory product. Accusations levelled against the writer, i.e., me, include that he collects endless details and piles them up, that he's a mere stenographer of Berlin dialect, that the streetcar numbers he cites are accurate, and that the book is ultra realistic. If you'd like to know how it should really be, you find out that our works will acquire the naturally simple speech of the proletariat, the smell and colour that truly belong to the proletariat. So let's ask, as a professional and a layman, how do we get there? The author's not allowed to be realistic. The details he gives mustn't be accurate. There should be no authentic Berlin dialect. So what then? I kept to the simple Berlin dialect, which I didn't copy down stenographically because I don't know how to be a stenographer. And if the details in my novel prove accurate, I do beg Herr Becker's pardon. I'm such a goof. When I mean Alexanderplatz, I say Alexanderplatz. And when I mean cottage cheesehead, I say Becher. And if I gather endless details, I promise that next time I'll do no gathering but pluck poetry straight out of the air. Oh, you radiant, wonderful, glowing believer. Listen to the literary leader of the party introducing a New Year's issue of the official organ of the German Communist Party. We are not such idealists as to idealize what is. But they don't know what is. We are not complacent. We do not claim to be satisfied. We tug and pound the drum. We incite so that the revolt will come sooner. That is our literature. We must proclaim it like a gospel. It rips through brain and heart. To which I say, without stenography, calm down, lad, for goodness sake. Here we have the ridiculous, wretched literary representatives of the German Communist Party. Little red flags waving over a reality that no one knows, from which they all step aside with cant phrases. Who wonders any more where the politics are? Phew.
That's great. Oh, and so how did Becker respond to that?
Well, the next issue of Linkskurve contained a very strong rebuttal because, obviously, Becher is read and admired by millions of revolutionary intellectuals around the world. They say his fame will long outlast Döblin and co. Döblin understands nothing of workers' psychology, for they never suffer Freudian complexes. Döblin doesn't have any style, he's just an irresponsible chatterbox. Berlin Alexanderplatz came not from the depths of his soul, but he just borrowed from the better James Joyce.
Ooh.
And that was enough to stymie a Russian translation that was being planned.
Oh,
Because
wow.
the International Bureau for Revolutionary Literature protested strongly that a writer who so insolently attacks Germany's proletarian literature has no right to be read by the workers of the Soviet Union.
Oh, gosh. Wow. And so Becker had been friendly with Döblin in previous years.
They'd been in contact. They were
They'd
both,
been in contact.
through the expressionist ferment,
Uh-huh.
on the First World War and so on. But then, later on in the 1930s in exile, Döblin did have one of his essays published in a journal that was edited by Becker in Moscow. And after the war, Becker contributed a little, tribute for Döblin's 70th birthday festschrift in 1948. So,
Oh, that's really interesting. So they
yeah.
still they were sparring partners. They were still friends, but
Well, yeah, they still had some regard for each other. But I mean, Döblin was, no great friend of, how does one put it politely, say, cant and nonsense.
Okay. Interesting. Very good. Very good. Well, I wonder, Chris, if that wraps us up for this episode. What do you think?
Well, this has gone on for an alarming 46 minutes, according to the clock. I don't know if
Yes.
they edit a lot of it down, but that's
Yes,
probably more than enough for our listeners to be going on with.
fantastic. All right. Well, I mean, that was great. I was a really interesting episode as well, especially the part about the different translators and how they would approach the language that's so particular to Berlin.
Yes.
Really interesting.
Right.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay,
I think that's goodbye from me.
and goodbye from me. Until next time. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Epic Worlds of Alfred Döblin. Join us next time to explore more about this fascinating writer's life and works. Meanwhile, visit the website beyond-alexanderplatz.com for posts about Döblin and some of his unjustly neglected contemporaries, as well as downloads of translations. So until next time, happy reading!